what you don't do, you sucks! I'm not gonna like listen.
Hello and welcome back to Miniature Dork Universe. Today we are going to build some of these Dragon Mini Armor 1144 scale Panzer IVs. We have an Aus H and an Aus G variant. Let's crack this thing open and see what's inside. It's very small. It's almost as small as the portion of my brain that's dedicated to common decency and maturity. So we'll cut through this and get into all this stuff, see what we have. Because we're doing H models and G models, we're going to remove those immediately from both, just so I don't forget later. I recommend when you start a new build, especially if more than one vehicle, put a fresh blade on your hobby knife. And I also suggest if you're working in 1144 scale, even if your eyesight's still good, get a pair of these, because your tiny little thing is going to look more like a 172 or 148 scale instead of this other thing. So, you know, not essential, but I would definitely recommend even if you've got eyes like a hawk. So I'm going to cut those off and then we'll begin with the first stage of the build. I cut off the vision port that needed to go for the G and H model. Something I'll mention when you're cutting off parts, even a fairly shallow part like this, don't try to get it all in one pass, because the knife will inevitably dig in and chop off too much. So take it off in small layers and then use the knife sort of just to lightly scrape away anything that's left until you get a nice flat surface. Then I use a file. There's a bit of sprue gate here just to file that off. I use files instead of knives when these things are thicker or wider, because the file does a better job cleaning it up. Again, with the knife you run the risk of scoring into the piece and getting weird knife marks. I always as well take a piece of fine sandpaper after I've done all my knife work and filing, and just give it one final fine sand, and that will keep all of your square edges looking nice and square. I cleaned up all of my parts with the knife, the file, and the sandpaper. I didn't run into a lot of flash, which is a nice thing about this kit. I can't stress enough how much a clean build really improves the build overall and makes the painting better. So I cleaned all of these. The rear armored plate has the exhaust on, and I hollowed out, I don't know if this will stay in focus for you, but I hollowed out the exhaust pipe with a knife, and I'm going to go back later with a very small drill bit and drill that out, just because it'll look more like a piece of pipe that way. I do the same with my gun barrels. So to get a nice clean glue job done, I use liquid cement. I dry fit the piece, so I've taken this front, in case it's so small and you didn't see, but I've taken this front armored plate and I'm going to dry fit it, and in this case it just stays in place, which is perfect. I'm going to take the glue with just a small amount, so when I take out the brush, I give it one swipe and just let the majority of the excess glue off, and then all you have to do is touch it in the corners, and the capillary action pulls that glue along the full length of the joint. I will continue gluing all these pieces on. You don't need to watch all of that. I just gave you my spiel about how I do my gluing. So I'll glue this on, and then we'll come back when this part, which is pretty much the first, there's two steps in building these things, 1 and 2. We're going to zero in at the end of 2. Make sure all of your wheels are parallel and coplanar. That's the other thing. Both sides, if you've glued on the side pieces wrong and they're wobbly, like again, you're gonna have weirdness as you go. So keep each step of the build as perfect as you can get it. Step 1 was completed. Another thing to watch out for is the drive sprocket and the idler wheel. Make sure those are nice and square, just like all the other wheels, because once again, that's going to influence how the tracks sit on the wheels. And the only thing left to do is hollow out the exhaust. It's a 0.4 drill and a pin vise. Pin vise is a very good tool to have. I would highly recommend to have it just for things like this. Get the glue on, take most of it off, and then just go into that hole and take off any little burrs of plastic, and that'll leave that looking nice and clean. The next step will be to put in the necessary parts to magnify the turrets. I find the magnified turrets work really well. These turret rings are a little bit tight, so the first thing I'm going to do is go around with a half-round file that's got a bit of a wider curve to it. I'm going to go around and just give that a quick file. The next step, I glue a piece of 0.5 millimeter plastic sheet in behind the turret ring that I just hollowed out. Very simply, just press the plastic in place and then use the liquid cement. And once those are glued into place, now we can try and stick these in. And like I said, I think it would have been wiser to put this back plate on, because it doesn't seem to move over the fenders too easily. But that's how it says to do it in the instructions. But it's really kind of a dick. I don't remember this being this big of a dick when I did them before. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on. It looks like they should just slide in. But for some reason, it's not. And that kind of... And yeah, really, when you push it, it just wants to really dent it. So I'm going to go figure out how to get this on, now that we've glued that back plate on. And I'll come back when I have. I'll tell you the secret trick. So the way I had to do it was to actually rip the back plate off. So if you haven't started this yet and you're going to build these, remember, don't put that back plate on until you have the top plate on. The directions show otherwise, but yeah, you're not going to get that top to fit otherwise. So I just pulled it back and put the... Geez, even still it doesn't want to go in. Holy shit, man. Pull it right off, I guess. Put on the top. I don't remember that from the first 3 that I built, but it must have been the same way. Otherwise, I'd have not done it that way. And then just slide this back. And it doesn't really make that much of a difference. You know, it looks exactly the same, really. If you're having trouble getting that piece off, if you glued it too well, just put some more of the cement on it, and that will sort of loosen it so that you can get it off. To create the assembly for the rare earth magnets, you're going to need a piece of, I think this tube is about 5 millimeters in diameter, just shy of 5 millimeters. Yeah, probably about 5 millimeters in diameter through the center. So a 5 millimeter rare earth magnet will probably drop in there. Or I think that's probably what, like 3/16 inner diameter. And outer diameter on this is roughly, that looks to be about 7 millimeters, or 1/4 of an inch. So you just need the one diameter. So we're going to cut it into 4 wafers because we're doing 2 tanks here. And 1 wafer goes up into the turret to accept the turret magnet. So that just goes right up inside. And again, we're just cutting off a thin enough slice to put the magnet in. And then we'll put a thin slice in the center. And it's got to be thinner than the depth of the hull. So you're just getting very thin slices, and then you'll drop the rare earth magnet into that. So what I use, and what many of you probably don't have, I have like a jeweler's miter box. So I use a jeweler saw for this, but you can use any, like even an X-Acto hobby saw. Like likely one that would go with the miter box would probably be the choice. And I just carefully cut this out. So the piece that goes on the hull needs to be quite a bit thinner than the piece on the turret. But you want them both shallow enough so that they're not hitting each other, causing the turret to sit too high. So this is literally like, you know, maybe a millimeter thick. Just enough so that you can seat that rare earth magnet in nice and soundly. So once I cut it off, for these I just give it a really quick cleanup with the X-Acto blade. Just clean the flash off a bit. It doesn't need to be awesome for this. There's usually like a little bit of a flange here. I just zap that off. Do a little bit of scrapey, and that should be good. The pieces inside the turret, I'll probably do about twice that thick because it's quite deep. Let's see. This shaft here is quite deep, so even if this was like 2.5 millimeters deep, it's deep enough for the turret. And I think I dropped 2 magnets in this one, and then 1 in the bottom. So it gives the tank a bit of weight, but it also gives you just the right amount of magnetism to keep the turret on nicely. Okay, so the piece has been cleaned up a bit, and what you want is for that ring to be bang in the middle. So it's slightly shallower than the depth of the plastic on the upper hull. And you want to get that in the middle, dead in the center. So how I do that is I sort of eyeball it. And I just use a little amount of glue to start with. And I put it on the inside of the ring. So just touch it so you get that sort of capillary action. It helps to have something like a dental pick so you can maneuver it. And then because I only used a tiny amount of glue, I can fit the actual turret on over it without it sticking the turret down. And that'll ensure that I've got that directly in the middle so that the turret will have the 360-degree rotation without any obstructions. And just let that sit for a while, and every once in a while make sure your turret isn't getting stuck down. And then, yeah, I would let that sit maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then go in with a lot of glue and really glue that inner ring down. And you'll get a good seal, and you'll know that it's nice and centered. So while I'm waiting for those pieces for the magnets to dry, I cut out and cleaned up the remaining parts for the part 2 on the instructions. So that would include the schurtzen for the turret, the front armor plate with the driver's viewport and the radio operator's machine gun, the 2 75mm L48 cannons, which I also hollowed out. I don't know if you can see that. I used a 0.5 drill bit after I used the knife first, made sure that they were nice and centered, and then used the 0.5 drill bit. I glued the remainder of the parts on for step 2, except for a tiny little light. So I'll show you how I deal with those tiny little parts. Also, something I probably should have shown you but forgot to do was how I put these turret schurtzen on, because they could be a bit of a dick. So what I did is put them on a flat surface, and I glued the two halves together at the back first and let that glue dry a bit so that it wouldn't fall apart. And then I carefully sort of pinched it over the turret and sort of finessed it into shape and hit it with a little bit of glue and set it on the tank, and then pushed it down so that it was level with the bottom of the turret. And you have to kind of finesse it a little bit, but definitely it helps to put it somewhere flat first, just the schurtzen, and glue the two halves together and just let it dry for like 5 minutes, and then you can set it back on. And it is a little bit tricky, but if you don't use too much glue too quickly, you can sort of finesse it into place and then add more glue as you go. But they look pretty good once they are on. How I deal with pieces as small as this tiny little light is I put a bit of sticky tack on the end of a dental pick, and then I'll apply the glue to the area that it needs to go, which is just up here, and then I will stick that down. And then once I get it on, I'll let it sit for a bit until the glue takes hold. Here's some stills for a better look. So yeah, just stick it on like that and pull it away when the glue is dry enough to do so. Let's move on to putting the magnets into the turrets. An important thing to do here is to make sure that you have the correct polarity, because if you put the polarity opposite, it's going to push the turret off instead of hold it down. So what I do is I put my magnets together that I'm going to use, and then I take a 180 or 150 sandpaper, 180 I guess, and sand either sides, and you'll know that the side that's been sanded is the side to glue, and the side that's still smoothed is the side not to glue. And also sanding it will give it a better surface for gluing, which is what you want. You want that to hold on nice and strong. Another thing I do is score the surface of the plastic that I'm going to glue to. Again, just to give it a better gluing surface. Because if it's all smooth, there's not going to be much for the super glue to adhere to. My super glue has gotten it's not even old, it's just gotten goopy for some crazy reason I don't quite understand. So place some into the area to be glued. It's a bit of a dick, so you can see it's very sticky. And then simply place the magnet in. I'm keeping them together. That way it makes them easier to handle for now. And I use toothpicks if you need to manipulate it around a bit. Obviously, if you use a metal pick, like a dental pick, it's going to stick to the magnet, and that's going to make you say bad words. Well, it makes me say bad words. Maybe it won't make you say bad words, but it definitely makes me say bad words. And then I've put some crazy glue accelerator in an old Tamiya bottle and a bit onto your toothpick, and you just hit it in there, and that gets that. And so now that that is solid, I'll get a bit more of the super glue, which is very stringy. I'm going to have to buy some new stuff this weekend. And then we will stick that in there. And when you go to put it on, it just sticks lovely like that. And it has a nice smooth turning action. It's not like grinding into the plastic beneath it. So enough of that, we'll get on with the tracks. So I've already sort of loosely fit the tracks onto this one, as you can see. So I put them in place first, and then I'll start gluing them. So I'll glue this to the top, just because there's not a lot of space between the track and the top fender. In this scale, it's not such a big deal though, especially when it's on the ground and you're looking at it like this, you know, you almost don't even need to add that piece across the top. I'm just doing it because I'm super anal. And like I said, I got another Panzer III kit, which has the same tracks. Just, you know, I found the cheapest Dragon Armor, mini armor kit I could find on eBay with the cheapest shipping, which in this case was free. And I just ordered it so I could take the parts to complete out these tracks and have a bunch of spares for my Sturmgeschütz 3s, because they didn't come with any spare wheels in the Victrix kit. So anyway, I have this spare because I bought it. If you don't have a spare that you've bought, then you won't be able to do this step. But if you do, then you can do this step, or at least you can glue this down. If you put the full schurtzen on, like this one, I didn't bother, you know, because you can't even see the top of the track. So if you're doing like a Normandy campaign or something, and you put the full schurtzen on, then you can totally skip this entire step. You can just glue them in place, and then that's fine. However, in the Italian campaign, as I mentioned before, they took these schurtzen off because the streets were so narrow that you know, they would run into buildings and things and tear them off. So they just said, "Fug it," and they took them off. And so here we go. Here's how I'm gonna fix these tracks. So get the pieces first and cut them. You know, I cut the extra sort of sprue material off, and then I cut the tracks and then stretch them first. So I just pull them, and carefully, you don't want to stretch the hell out of them, but just carefully stretch them out. You don't want to break them either, but stretching them out will mean that you'll get more out of your you know, your spare pieces if you ended up going the route that I did. Or if you're doing this, you could just buy an extra 4 too and use some of the spare parts, I don't know. So stretch them out. And then another important thing I'll show up here, you want to get the orientation of the tracks correct. Because if you put them on backwards, you know, it's not the end of the world, especially on something this small, but if you can get it right, why not? So I'm going to need to get my glasses for this so I can see my goggles. So what I do is I find the orientation of the tracks, and then over the drive sprocket and the first fender here, I just press that in, because it's so tight it's kind of hard to slide it in. So I just sort of pressed it in like that, and then you can shove it down with a dental pick or a pin or whatever it is you use for this kind of thing, and just shove it in. And then through the back you can sort of push it up through. And once I get it through, I'll grab it with the toothpick and just slide it in. And just keep sort of fudging with it until you get it roughly where you want it to be. Make sure all of the guide teeth are inside where they need to be, in between the two wheels. And also make sure you let this dry like a good 24 hours before you do this, because you want these tracks to go on nicely and not take off the tops of the wheels. And it'll also keep your alignment nice, because that's important if you want it to look nice. And so yeah, these tracks are going to sort of dip down, but I'm going to like super glue the tops of those in place, and then I'm going to go along the wheels on the bottom, the road wheels, and just add super glue to the bottoms of all of these and just sort of push it down. And that should glue them all in place. And then when I get to the painting step, I'll give the whole thing a primer coat. And the primer coat will also help sort of adhere these tracks down. And between the glue and the primer and the subsequent paint and varnish coats, you know, that'll be enough to keep these nice and solid. And they look pretty good. The detail on them has been molded in pretty well. So I'm going to put in the other track. You don't need to see that. And then I'll come back when I get to the crazy gluing. Alright, so here's how I proceed with this. I'm going to get some half-decent super glue. This stuff, BSI. And this is a film canister, an old 35mm film canister that I keep my push pins in. Like, I just have push pins for basic construction and things. And I'm going to put a gob of the super glue on the top of the lid. I never usually apply super glue direct from the bottle. That's just a recipe for disaster. And I'm going to start with the road wheels first. So I just pull the track aside. And I'm going to take some of the glue on my toothpick and just add some to the bottoms of all of the wheels. Not a lot, you don't need a lot because you're going to do every single wheel. So just the sheer number of glued points will make that strong. And then carefully, without getting your fingers in the glue you just put on, set that down and just push those into the tracks nice and straight. So there, all the tracks are reasonably square and nice. They don't look all bent weird and bizarre. I'm not going to bother putting any around the drive sprocket because it looks pretty square. It's got a fairly wide point, and when everything else is straight, that looks pretty straight too. So what I'm going to do next is you want to make sure that the tracks line up nicely with the fenders before you glue them down, so that you don't have this weirdness going on. So just take your time with this. If you take your time with this kind of stuff, it usually works out well. If you get kind of rambunctious and impatient with it, it generally makes you want to punch stuff and cry yourself to sleep. So fortify yourself mentally before getting involved with this kind of shit. And if you do, you'll win. And we like to win. So I put down some glue. I'm just going to press that down with the tweezers. And that's cured already. Beautiful. And I'll put this down until that's cured. And beautiful. Beauty. So that's all glued down, and then I'll do the other side, and then when I come back, I'm just going to cut the piece out of this that I need to fill in the void here, and then we'll be done. And then you can have your Panzer IV G or H without side schurtzen and a full set of tracks going all the way around. And like I said, if you're doing like a Normandy, or if you don't care, if you're not as freaking stupid as I am about the historical accuracy, then you can just put the schurtzen on and you don't need to do this. Although I would still, I mean, you're obviously going to have to cut the tracks and glue them down, so I would do this part for sure and then put the schurtzen on, because it's nice when your tracks stay like this. These rubber band tracks tend to, like, you know, when you're handling them, they'll start wobbling around. This keeps them in place. So here we go. I cut off the piece that I need to size with the spare piece that we have. Make sure that the track is oriented the right way so that the track lines up well. And then I'm going to stick these in place before I glue them, 2. Just so that you get a nice sort of continuation of the track. If you put the glue on, you're likely to glue it before you can register it. So I use like pointy tweezers or like a dental pick and just slide it into position where you want it. Like that. Like that. And that's good. And so rather than glue behind it, I'm just going to put a little glue along the seam where the two meet. The glue is sort of the more runny style of crazy glue. And I'm just going to glue it in between where the two tracks meet. Next, I'm going to put on a few stowage things like some spare tracks and spare wheels. The Panzer IVs don't really have tons and tons of stowage. Sometimes you see some where they've put a lot of packs and bags inside the turret schurtzen, away from the side hatches obviously, but I'm not going to bother with that. When I look at pictures of Panzer IVs in Italy, they don't seem to be overweighed with stowage. So I'm just going to put a few pieces here and there just to give each tank its own sort of individual look. And then we'll move on to the painting step. The color I'm going to use is just Tamiya dark yellow. And I've opted not to do a primer coat. This Tamiya paint is very strong, so I just use this straight up primer on plastic. Or sorry, I use this as the primer. So I'm not going to lighten this color. Normally you should for scale effect, but I'm going to do a lot of modulation on this, so I want a darker base color. So we'll get on with that. The other thing I'm going to throw in with these Panzer IVs is a little Panzer II. This is a kit from Pit Road. So I magnetized the turret for that guy as well. The Panzer II was phased out pretty much by this time, but you see the odd use of them right through to the end of the war. Sometimes in the headquarters they use these for reconnaissance. They were small, nimble little tanks, so not really good for head-to-head fights with other tanks, but you know, in windy, tight little roads in Italy, if you wanted to get a quick reconnaissance conducted, you could have something like this. I know the 12th SS had one in Normandy that they used for that reason, so why not these guys in Italy? Now we'll give them a nice base coat, building up layers of paint so that the paint goes on nice and smooth. To mix the paint this time, I'm going to use 3 of these syringes. One for the white, one for the yellow, and one for the thinner. So I will do probably 2 parts of the dark yellow to 1 part white. Okay, sorry about the blur here. I guess my compressor was touching the tripod of my camera, shaking the hell out of it. But I'm just using the various methods and techniques to get my modulation down. The modulation is complete, and I just did a very basic modulation. The kits are so bloody small that it's kind of hard to control the airbrush. I only ended up using tape on the schurtzen, and the rest I was mostly using bits of cut up Zvezda Art of Tactic card to get straight lines like over the turret. Now it's time to break out the paint brushes, and the first color we're going to do is our Dunkelgelb highlights.
So I've mixed middle stone, German camouflage beige, and white. 1 part to 1 part to 1 part. You can add more white if you want it to get a bit lighter, but the mix is pretty good. The straight up middle stone and German camouflage beige makes a great mix that matches the Tamiya dark yellow that I used for the base coat. Next up, we do all the road wheels and the machine guns, and for that I used black gray. Then on to the tracks. I did a mix, I do this for all my tanks, a mix of chocolate brown and black gray. You could probably use the extra dark German camouflage brown too, but this is what I have, so this is what I use. On to the muffler, and for that I'm just going to use straight up chocolate brown, and then later it'll get some dry brushes of reddish and orangey browns to give it a more rusty look. Then the wooden tool handles and the jack blocks, I use beige brown, which is my go-to color for most wooden things. And then lastly, the metal tool parts, I wanted a slightly different color, so for that I used dark gray. This was totally unnecessary, but I did just straight up primer on the bottom because it was detailed, and for that I used hull red and red leather. The next step on our pathway to success stories is to put a coat of clear varnish, or Tamiya clear, onto the tank to prepare and optimize the surface for decals and washes.
I've covered up the turret ring with a blob of sticky tack, and that's just going to prevent too much paint from getting in there and making it too tight for the turret to fit on. And I've just stuck the turret on some little painting posts as well. So I'm going to get on with the gloss coat.
The gloss coat was applied and allowed to dry, so now I'm going to move on with the decals. These are the I-94 Enterprise decals. They're yellow numbers with black outlines that are sort of consistent with the 16th Panzer Division, which was present at the Salerno landings. However, I'm kind of trying to make these a little generic. These kind of make them specific to 16th Panzer Division, but I just want a Panzer IV that looks like it'll belong in the Mediterranean, in Italy, possibly even Sicily. So looking at several pictures, as you know I do, I research this stuff when I go. I was trying to think, how do I get the most, Mediterranean theater looking Panzer IV, and the majority of them were just left straight up Dunkelgelb, so I'm going to leave them as straight up Dunkelgelb. And often when you do see camouflage patterns on them, they're very messy. They're actually not very nice. I'm not going to show you the entire, decal process, but I have done an entire video on how I get the decals down, get them sitting nice and flat, or get them to sit over, bumpy textures like with Solvaset. In this case, there isn't a lot. I still use the Solvaset because it kind of melts the decal into the model, and then I go over it with a brush and more of the Tamiya clear. And then when I put my matte coat on, you see no trace of any carrier film. It looks like the decal's been painted on. I've placed the decals and I've used a setting solution. I'll let the whole thing sort of set overnight with the setting solution, and then tomorrow I will give it another coat just with a paintbrush, like a good quality paintbrush, a little coat of the Tamiya clear over the decals, and that'll seal them in permanently. Wash, I always give it a spray of flow improver to help the capillary action of the acrylics. It just it reduces the surface tension of water. Flow aid and additive, it's called, and it's 1 part of this to 20 parts water. I'm only going to use the ammo washes for the black, like the panel lines, like going into hatches and access panels on the engine deck. I think the ammo acrylic wash is actually more like a watercolor, and so there's fairly large pigment residue, I guess is the word you would call it. So it's not really working on the rest of the tank. It was kind of crusty. Next I'm going to do the Citadel washes. And I do this pretty simply. I'm going to take a couple gobs of the Agrax Earthshade, soak up a brush with that. And then I'm going to get about an equal amount of the Nuln oil. To make a nice dark brown. Wipe that off my brush, maybe clean that off a bit. And then I'll use the Lamian medium. I'll put a few good doses of that in and then just mix it all up. I'm to the stage where I'm going to give it a coat of our fun-loving AK Ultra Matte varnish. And before I do that, I will mention that I gave the tracks, after putting the wash on them, I hit them with a dry brush of this AK Extreme Metal Steel. So that looks quite good. If it loses some of its sheen from the matte coat, I'll probably come back later and give it a quick little touch up with this. The matte varnish is on and dry, and you can see it's tied in all the colors nicely. So all that's left to do is I'm going to go in with paintbrush. I'll do a little dry brush over the engine deck to clean up any of the wash that got a little bit crazy. I'm going to make the exhaust look rusty. I'm going to highlight up the spare tracks, give them a slightly rusty look, but not super rusty. I think they put a lot of magnesium in the steel, so yeah, like a little rusty. And enough to highlight the track segments, but that's about it. I might add, with really watered down acrylic, I might add a few streaks to the turret schurtzen and maybe to the top of the turret, but not to any of the smaller areas. It's just too small. And the streaks I'm going to be very sparring. You know, I'm not going to go to town with weathering just because it's so small. The as you can see, like the overall paintwork and wash has really brought up all the details, and that's what I'm going to keep. I'll use some of my colors that I use for my basing to make some dust inside the tracks, but I'm not going to go crazy with that too, because when it's sitting on the table, it's so low to the table, even when it's really close to your face. You don't even really see the tracks that much. So again, I'm not going to go to town on the weathering. They're just so small. I might do like very minimal chipping around the edges of the fenders, and maybe some on the turret schurtzen, definitely on the side schurtzen on the one, and then we'll call that complete.
Now for the other colors used for my final brushwork to complete the project. The wood highlights were put on with Panzer Ace's old wood. The spare track highlights were put on with saddle brown, which I just dry brushed on to get the texture out. And lastly, the muffler was highlighted to make it look like rust, and I used red leather first, and then a lighter dose of orange brown on top of the red leather.
Alright fellows, here's the moment you've been waiting for. The end. You might hear a sound in the background. That's just my cat going to town on a toy. He's having way too much fun. Well, not really. Anyway, yeah, so we're done. And I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. Just straight up dunkelgelb Panzer IVs for the Italian front. And of course, being 1943, these could be camouflaged up in a variety of different ways. But I just chose to leave them nice and plain. But, you know, saying nice and plain, however, they're quite small. And so there's a lot of detail packed into a small area. So, you know, I like the way it turned out. I'm happy that I chose to go with this sort of color scheme. So I'll end it off as per normal with a bunch of still photos. And today it's New Year's Day, so I'd just like to say to everyone everywhere in the world, Happy New Year's. Here's hoping we get a better one this year. You know, hopefully we could move past this sort of binary, socially engineered culture we've ended up in and, you know, start taking care of things. Anyway, good luck for the new year, and we'll see you soon for another fun-loving round of Miniature Dork Universe.
Escape your mind.